A shovel hit iron in a field in England, 1939. That sound opened something, a world that had been forgotten. The Sutton Hoo ship burial. It's a story of a king with no name, a grave with no body, a time capsule from the centuries after Rome fell. The chaotic ones, there are principles here. 5 of them, principles of power, the kind that built the first English kingdoms. They weren't written down, they were written in other things: gold, steel, earth. We'll see why a warlord's coffin was a warship, how treasures got there, from Byzantium, from Sweden, ended up in an English mound, and what a society chooses. What it decides to bury forever when it wants to make a legend. The world went quiet, not a peaceful quiet, a hollow one. For 400 years, Britain's rhythm was Roman. The sound of soldiers on stone roads, the clink of coins in a market, the word of an emperor coming from so far away. Then, around 410, that rhythm just stopped. The legions left to defend the empire's center, and they never came back. What they left wasn't empty. It was a ghost, the ghost of an empire, still there in the landscape it built. Think about those first years, the big villas with their heated floors. They went cold. Weeds grew in the roads where no messengers traveled. The whole economy, that complicated system of trade, it broke apart. Into pieces. Coins got rare, then they were gone. Writing, the thing that held the administration together, faded from use. The light of that centralized state flickered out. And in that growing dark, new sounds started. From the north and west, the Picts and the Scots, pressing on borders that weren't defended anymore. And from across the sea, from the wetlands in the north, others came. Angles, Saxons, Jutes, they came in boats, not one big army but families, war bands. They came for land, they came because the power was gone. This wasn't a quick change. Roman to Anglo-Saxon, it was a long twilight, a messy one. Centuries of people moving, languages shifting, loyalties changing. From that collapse, little kingdoms started to form. Around a hill fort, a river valley, their rulers weren't emperors, they were warlords, chieftains. Their power wasn't in tax records, it was in the loyalty of their fighters. The fear they put in their neighbors. This is the fractured world the man from Sutton Hoo was born into. A world where the old symbols meant nothing. A Roman coin meant nothing if the empire wasn't there to back it. A written decree meant nothing if no one could read it. So how does a leader prove he's in charge? How does he get respect, make alliances, make people believe he should rule? He can't show a paper from a distant capital. He has to build his authority from nothing. Using a language this turbulent age understood, the language of spectacle, of treasure, of connection to myth, his power had to be worn, it had to be held. It had to be displayed, and it had to be buried with him. A statement so grand it would echo for generations. The stage was chaos and opportunity, and in Suffolk, a king was getting ready for his final performance. His most magnificent one. The ghost of that ship waited almost 1400 years. It was waiting for a woman named Edith Pretty. She owned this land in Suffolk, an estate with these mounds on it. She had a feeling about them, a sense they were important. So in 1939 she hired a man, not a university professor, a local archaeologist, a self-taught expert named Basil Brown. He knew the soil of his county. He started on the largest mound, and his shovel struck iron almost immediately. Not junk, a pattern, rivet after iron rivet laid out in a curve in the earth. He was tracing the outline of a vessel. That curve grew as they worked. They brushed away the soil. It grew until they saw it, the dark impression of a ship, 27 meters long, pressed into the sand. The wood was gone, eaten by the acidic earth, but its ghost remained, a perfect negative image in the soil. A warship pulled from the sea and dragged a mile inland to be a tomb. The real mystery was at its center. Inside that wooden phantom they found a chamber, a room built where the ship's heart would be, the burial chamber. And as Basil Brown and his team worked, brushing with infinite care, the world inside began to gleam, a glint of gold first, then the dull sheen of silver. The glimmer of garnet, piece by piece, they lifted a lost kingdom into the light, a magnificent helmet with a face mask of iron and bronze, a heavy gold belt buckle woven with strange beasts, silver bowls from Byzantium, coins from Francia, a shield, a sword, a lyre, a king's arsenal and his treasury, all in one place. The timing of this discovery hangs over everything. It was the spring of 1939. The shadows of a coming war were stretching across Europe, as these treasures of a forgotten English civilization were being wrapped for safety. A new darkness was gathering. Months later, the world would be at war again. There's a profound poignancy in that. The treasures of a society forged in the chaos after one empire fell, being saved from the chaos as another catastrophic conflict began. It feels like a message in a bottle, thrown from one age of turmoil to another. This moment of discovery is our first direct window. We're not guessing about post-Roman power from old poems anymore. We're staring at its physical manifesto. Everything in that chamber was a deliberate choice, every object placed there with purpose, so the question shifts. It's no longer just what they buried, it's why. What story were they trying to tell for eternity? The answer starts with the most personal item they found. And the one that was strangely absent. The most personal things in that chamber were a set of items prepared for a man's last trip, but the man was gone. Right in the middle of the ship where his body should have been, the soil told you something else. The chemistry of the earth had worked it all away. Just a faint stain in the shape of a person, and some phosphate dust, a chemical ghost. He was there and he wasn't. It leaves this powerful absence. We have his story, told in incredible detail by the things he owned, but we can't see his face. That absence makes you listen harder to what the objects are saying. And the first thing, the loudest statement, isn't an object, it's the container. The ship itself. You have to think about the effort. This wasn't a ceremonial canoe built nearby. This was a seagoing warship built for the open ocean for battle. Over 80 feet long, powered by 40 oarsmen. After its last voyage, it was sailed or rowed up the River Deben. Then the real work started. They hauled it out of the water. And then an army of people dragged this huge wooden hull over a mile inland, uphill, to this high bluff over the river. They dug a trench exactly the shape of the ship. They lowered it in, and then they built a wooden house, the burial chamber, right in the center. After the ceremony, they mounted 20 tons of earth over the top, a landmark that would dominate the skyline for generations. This was a project that would have taken weeks, hundreds of people. Every single one of them knew they were building a monument, not just to a man, but to his power. This is the first, most basic principle of post-Roman power on display. Command over labor, the ability to make people stop their daily lives, come together, and do this colossal, back-breaking task. It was a public demonstration, where a Roman official might prove his status with a written decree from the emperor. This king proved his by moving a mountain. Or at least by moving a ship, but the meaning goes deeper than just strength. In the world this man came from, the world of the northern seas, a ship wasn't just a tool. It was a symbol packed with meaning, a vessel to the afterlife, a belief found from Scandinavia to Suffolk. To be buried in a ship was to start a final, sacred voyage. But a ship also meant something here, in the world of the living. It was the ultimate symbol of mobility, of connection, of reach. A king who ruled from a hill fort ruled land. But a king buried in a warship said something greater. He was a seafarer, a trader whose networks spanned continents, a warlord whose warriors could strike anywhere the river met the sea. His authority didn't end at the shore. It went across the water to the lands where his silver came from, the people who forged his sword. The ship burial shouts that this wasn't a local chieftain. This was a figure of international stature. He commanded the loyalty of men on land and the respect of peoples across the sea, and by choosing this as his coffin, he fused those two ideas for good. His final journey was his greatest voyage, and his coffin was the very engine of his earthly power. The stage was set. Now the props on it would tell an even more surprising story about where that power really came from. Two things in that chamber stood out. More than their weight in gold, it was their weight in meaning. The helmet and the scepter, the crown and the staff, but for a different kind of kingdom. Take the helmet first. It's a piece of controlled terror. From far away you see a warrior's face, bronze eyebrows, a gilded mustache, but then you look closer. Those eyebrows aren't just eyebrows, they're stylized wings ending in a dragon's head. The mustache is another dragon, its body curving down to form the nose, the mouth. Two more dragons arch over the skull, meeting to form a crest. It's this swirling puzzle of protective beasts, so it wasn't just armor, it was a psychological weapon. In a mead hall's flickering light or on a misty field, that face would have been something else. It turned the man into a myth, a being from the old poems. The craft itself is astonishing. A single piece of iron hammered, then covered with tinned bronze panels, detailed with intricate designs. The style is Swedish. It likely came from a royal workshop in Scandinavia, a gift or a prize that crossed the sea, and that tells us something. The kingship this man embodied wasn't local. It was part of a shared northern culture of warrior aristocrats. To be a king was to be the best fighter, the ring giver, the leader of the war band. The helmet screams that. It's the symbol of the martial protector, the one who guarantees safety through force. But then, right beside it, they found something completely different. A scepter, a simple stone whetstone for sharpening blades mounted on a stand, topped with a delicate bronze stag. This object has no parallel, it's unique. Its meaning is more mysterious, maybe more profound. The stag is an old symbol of sovereignty. In Celtic and Germanic traditions, it represents the forest, the wild land a king is meant to protect. A whetstone is practical, but here, transformed, it becomes something else. A symbol of justice, maybe, the sharpening of what's right, or it might point to a more priestly, sacral authority. Where the helmet speaks of the god of war, the scepter whispers of a connection to the earth, to law, to the rituals that bind a community. That's the second principle of power. Leadership wasn't one thing. A king had to be two people at once. The fierce dragon-helmed warlord, inspiring loyalty and fear, and the sacred figure with the stag, who mediated with the gods, upheld tradition, administered justice. Both the sword and the scale, Sutton Hoo shows this duality perfectly. Power in that era had to be multifaceted. To hold a kingdom together, you needed more than a strong arm. You needed a symbol that reached into every part of life, from the terror of battle to the order of the homestead. And if these objects told the story of authority inside the kingdom, the next set of treasures showed how far the king's network outside it really went. The treasures at Sutton Hoo, they're like a conversation, and some of those objects, they speak in a very direct voice, the voice of a warrior. In that central space, the archaeologists found a king's personal arsenal. That was the third principle of power, made solid, made into iron and steel. In that age, wealth wasn't just for hoarding, it was a weapon, and the most potent weapon was the sword. They found it lying where the king's hand would have been, a long blade pattern welded. To make a sword like that was an act of high art and immense patience. A smith didn't just take one bar of iron and hammer it out. He took rods, different grades of iron and steel, twisted them into complex patterns, then forged them together into a single ribbon of metal. The result was a blade with a rippling, watery pattern along its length. It was beautiful, but the beauty was functional. This technique created a blade that was flexible and held a brutally sharp edge, superior to anything made from a single material. It was a technological marvel, the equivalent of a precision instrument today. Owning it said you had access to the most elite smiths, maybe from the Rhineland or even farther. It said you understood a quality most people would never see. But more than that, it was a direct extension of the king's role. He was the protector, the ultimate warrior. His personal skill in battle, or the skill of the champion who fought for him, that was the final guarantee for his people's safety. That sword was the symbol of that covenant, forged in fire. But a king doesn't fight alone. The other items in the arsenal show he was the center of a band. A comitatus, the massive shield, a round of lime wood covered in leather, with a gleaming iron boss at its center and ornate gilt fittings that was as much a standard as it was protection. In the press of a shield wall, that shining center would have marked the king's position, a rallying point for his men, the coat of mail, a garment of thousands of interlinked iron rings. That represented a staggering investment, in time, in resources. It was the ultimate personal armor, a luxury of defense only the most important could afford. Then there were the spears, some for throwing, some for thrusting. These were the weapons of the common warrior, but these weren't common. Their iron heads were finely made. And their presence in the grave is key. A king's power rested on his ability to reward his followers, giving a well-made spear, a good shield. That was a tangible act of generosity. That bought loyalty. By including them in his grave, he was making a final statement. Even in death, he was the ring giver, the provider of arms, the heart of the warrior band. This entire collection shouts a single truth for that time. Power had to be backed by martial virtue. In a landscape of small, competing kingdoms, where borders shifted with the season's campaign, a ruler couldn't be seen as weak. His wealth had to be converted into visible, intimidating force. The quality of the arms displayed his access to far-off expertise, to rare materials. Their sheer presence demonstrated his ability to equip and lead men. This was power you could hold in your hand, power that could decide the fate of a community with a single charge. But if this arsenal was for conquest and defense, the next set of treasures answered a different question. What did this powerful king do in times of peace? How did he entertain? How did he inspire? How did he connect his people to something beyond the battlefield? The answer lay in something far more delicate than iron. The king's power wasn't just built on the battlefield. It was built in the hall, that great wooden hall with its central hearth, its high roof. That was the heart of the kingdom. It was a court, a feast hall, a treasury, and in the Sutton Hoo chamber they found the tools for ruling that space. The fourth principle of power wasn't conquest. It was hospitality, the economics of prestige. They found the king's feast kit, massive drinking horns, their ends mounted with silver gilt bands. They came from an aurochs, a wild ox gone from those lands now. Just getting them was a feat, a sign of far-reaching hunts or trade. There were maple wood cups bound with delicate silver, a huge iron chain for hanging a cauldron over the fire, and a Coptic bowl from the eastern Mediterranean, thin as an eggshell, made to hang and sway to catch the firelight. You think of the scene, long winter nights. The hall thick with smoke, the smell of roasting meat, the king on his high seat, his warriors, his advisors, his craftsmen on benches, the great cauldron simmering. Mead that honeyed wine poured from the hanging bowl into the cups, the drinking horns passed hand to hand. This wasn't just a party, it was the core ritual of early medieval politics. In a world without salaries, without written contracts, loyalty was a currency, and it was bought with generosity. By feasting his men, the king performed his wealth. He showed he could provide not just in war, but in peace. Every bite of food, every horn of mead was a gift, and each gift created a debt, an obligation. The warrior who ate the king's meat, who drank his mead, was bound to repay that gift with service, with counsel, with his sword when the time came. The feast was where stories were told, where reputations were made, where alliances were whispered over a cup. It was where the king listened to his people. And they, in turn, saw him not just as a commander, but as a ring giver, the provider, the capacity to host these gatherings week after week, season after season, that showed a deeper kind of strength. It showed control over resources, herds of cattle, stores of grain, barrels of ale. It required a network of farms, tenants, all working to supply the hall. This soft power was the glue that held the warrior band together. The loyalty inspired over a shared cup could be as strong as the loyalty forged in a shield wall. By burying his feast gear, the king was making a final statement. His authority wasn't just taken by force, it was earned through generosity, maintained through a cycle of gift and obligation. The hall was where a kingdom was built, one toast at a time, and if the feast bound men to their lord, the last set of treasures in the chamber showed who this lord was bound to. They pointed beyond the hall, beyond the sea, to the edges of the known world, weaving this local king into a tapestry of connections that would redefine his legacy. The most personal statement of power was worn on the body. In the burial chamber, they found things of incredible intimacy, a purse lid, but it wasn't leather. It was solid gold, inlaid with garnets and mosaics of Millefiori glass, and a pair of shoulder clasps, also gold and garnet, for holding a cloak. These weren't just fasteners. They were masterpieces. Look at the purse lid. It's divided into symmetrical panels, each filled with interlocking creatures, beasts with long bodies, limbs woven into knots. Their jaws snap at their own tails or at another creature. That's the animal interlace style, and it's not random. For them, these writhing patterns were a code. They meant strength, the constant struggle of forces, the protective power of the wild. To wear this was to cloak yourself in the attributes of those beasts. A declaration of ferocity, an identity tied to the old stories. The shoulder clasps take it further. Their design is more complex, a lattice of gold cells, each one filled with a sliver of garnet cut to a perfect fit. The garnets are a statement. They didn't come from England. They likely came from India or Sri Lanka, traveling thousands of miles through trade to reach a workshop in Kent. The technique is cloisonné. A goldsmith would build tiny walls on a gold backing, creating a blueprint. Then a stone setter would fill each cell with garnet, like a delicate, durable puzzle. That work required specialists, itinerant master craftsmen who served only the very top tier, moving from kingdom to kingdom. Their presence in a court was itself a sign of prestige. So when you look at these, you see the fifth principle of post-Roman power, the theater of ceremony. Power had to be performed, and the king's own body was the stage. Imagine him in his hall by the fire. The flames would catch those garnets, making them burn like tiny captured embers. The gold would gleam. Every slight movement would send shimmers of crimson and yellow light across the room. He wasn't just a man in fine clothes, he was a living icon. The interlacing beasts on his chest proclaimed his mythical lineage, his connection to a heroic past. The luxury of the materials, gold from Byzantium, garnets from across the world, proclaimed his reach, his wealth, his place in an international network. And the staggering skill proclaimed his discernment. He could command the best artists of the age. This wearable wealth did something. It made authority visible, tangible, and utterly remote. A common warrior could aspire to a good sword, but he could never aspire to this. This was the visual language of kingship, a language of such refined expense and connection that it created an unbridgeable gap between the ruler and the ruled. It transformed the man into an institution. Every feast, every public appearance was a performance reinforced by the treasures on his person. His power wasn't just held. It was worn, and in that final act of burial, that performed power was sealed for eternity. a permanent testament to the image he crafted. But a king's legacy is never just about the treasures. It's about the world he leaves behind, the shadow he casts. The story of Sutton Hoo doesn't end in that mound. It ripples outward. It forces a bigger question about the society that could produce such a figure, and what his spectacular farewell meant for the future taking shape on those shores. No name was ever found. Not one inscription in that chamber said who was buried there. The king became a ghost known only by the echo of his wealth. So the great puzzle of Sutton Hoo is this: we have the most spectacular royal burial of early England, and we don't know the king's name. But historians have a very strong candidate, a man who fits the time, the place, and the profound contradictions buried with him. His name was Reidwold. King of the East Angles in the early 700s, he appears in the writings of the monk Bede, our best source for that era. Bede tells us Reidwold was a king of immense power. A Bretwalder, a term meaning something like Britain ruler, he held sway over other kingdoms south of the Humber. For a time, he was the most powerful man in the land. And his life was defined by a spiritual tug of war. He was baptized as a Christian while visiting Kent. But when he returned home, his wife and his pagan advisors persuaded him not to abandon the old gods. So Bede says he set up a unique altar. In the same temple, he had one altar for the Christian sacrifice and another for sacrifices to the old gods. He was hedging his bets, covering all the spiritual bases. That historical portrait fits the Sutton Hoo burial perfectly. The date of the coins in the purse places the burial around 625, exactly when Reidwold would have died. And the objects tell the same story of a divided loyalty. There are clear pagan symbols everywhere. The ship burial itself is a pagan practice. The helmet with its protective dragons speaks to the warrior ethos of the old world. The animal interlace on the goldwork connects to pre-Christian myths. Yet nestled among this pagan splendor are hints of the new faith, those silver spoons from Byzantium. They're engraved with the names Saul and Paul, a clear reference to the apostles' conversion. They might have been a baptismal gift, and the two small crosses found among the regalia, though they could have been just decorative, feel like quiet acknowledgments of the new god gaining influence. This isn't the burial of a devout pagan, nor of a committed Christian. It's the burial of a man caught between two worlds, a practical ruler trying to navigate a monumental cultural shift without fracturing his kingdom. His power depended on unifying people who still believed in the old ways and those drawn to the new religion from Rome. By honoring both in his final monument, he made a political statement as much as a spiritual one. He was saying his authority transcended any one belief system. It was a flexible power, adaptable, designed to include. That identity crisis at the heart of Sutton Hoo is its own profound lesson. The individual's name was lost, but the office he held screams out to us. The power was so monumental, so carefully constructed through objects and symbols, that it outlasted the man himself. We analyze the kingship, the institution, the role of the ring giver, the protector, the sacred figure, the international diplomat. That role is what Sutton Hoo preserves. The man may have turned to dust, but the blueprint for early English kingship was cast in gold and garnet, waiting in the dark for a future age to read it. And that blueprint would be tested not in the peace of a burial mound, but in the violent birth pangs of a nation. The treasures were a map, not of a kingdom, but of a mind. A king's mind. He saw his world as connected. Every object in that chamber came from somewhere else. And if you plot those places on a map, you don't see an isolated island. You see a web of influence stretching across the known world. Take the helmet with its dragon faces, its tinned bronze panels. That style is unmistakable. It speaks of workshops in Sweden, of the Vendel culture. Those Scandinavian shores were a powerhouse of warrior art. For that helmet to end up in an English grave, it meant something. A gift between royal houses, or the spoil from a campaign, or a master craftsman who traveled with his skills. It shouted a shared identity, a kinship with the seafaring aristocrats of the north. Then there's the gleam of silver, two shallow, broad bowls. Their stamps tell the story. They were made in the Byzantine Empire, in the workshops of Constantinople. That's over 2,000 miles away. This wasn't just trade. This was prestige diplomacy. These could have been a formal gift, sent from an emperor's court to a powerful king on the edge of the world. To own them was to say, I matter to Rome's successor. The greatest civilization on earth knows my name. The coins in the purse tell a quieter tale. They are Merovingian. From the kingdom of the Franks, in what's now France and Germany, this was the economic network. Coins were for buying, for paying, for storing wealth in a portable form. Their presence shows this kingdom was plugged in. Goods and people flowed along those monetary channels. Even the most mysterious object, the stag-topped scepter, whispers of distant connections. The swirling patterns on that stone have a Celtic flavor. They recall the art of the peoples the Anglo-Saxons had displaced, the ancient Britons. Was it an heirloom kept and repurposed? A symbol chosen to claim legitimacy over the land and its older inhabitants. Each thread had a purpose. The Swedish connections affirmed his warrior heritage. The Byzantine silver showcased his diplomatic stature. The Frankish coins proved his economic reach. The Celtic echoes may have rooted his rule in the very soil. So this geographic collage reveals something. It reveals the fourth dimension of early medieval power, connection. A king's strength wasn't measured just by the land he controlled, but by the breadth of his network. He was a node, a point where strands from across Europe came together. These exotic goods were his legitimacy. In a world with no newspapers, no internet, how do you prove you're a major player? You show the room things no one else can get. You serve wine from a bowl made in an emperor's city. You wear a helmet from a legendary northern smithy. You pay your men with coins accepted from Frisia to Francia. This collection was his resume, written not on parchment but in silver, gold, and garnet. It said, I am not a local strongman. I am an international figure. His power was built through long-distance diplomacy, through savvy trade, and almost certainly through marriage alliances that wove his family into other royal lines. The Mound at Sutton Hoo wasn't a tomb for a warlord. It was the headquarters of a networker, and that network, so carefully woven, was about to be tested. By a force that traveled not on trade routes, but on the pages of a book. That king was buried with a contradiction, a spiritual one. Right there in the Suffolk soil, they laid to rest a delicate political calculation. The ceremony was a grand pagan farewell, a ship burial, a voyage to the afterlife guided by the old gods. That practice was centuries old in the north. But among the warriors' gold, there were two small silver spoons. They tell a different story. They're inscribed, one with the name Solos, the other with Paulos. Saul and Paul, those names refer to the apostles' conversion on the road to Damascus, a foundational story for the new Christian faith. These weren't just tableware. They were almost certainly a baptismal gift, marking a personal moment of conversion. So you have a man given a Christian name in a pagan ship. That's not an accident. It's a strategy. Think of the world he ruled. The early 700s were a hinge moment. Roman missionaries had landed in Kent decades earlier. The new religion was spreading. Carried by its powerful message and its connection to the sophisticated remains of the old Roman world, it appealed to kings looking for new ways to legitimize their rule, to tie into a wider European network. But the old ways had deep roots. They were woven into the cycles of harvest and battle, into the stories told in the hall, into the loyalty of the elders and the warriors. To reject them outright was dangerous. A king who turned his back on the gods of his ancestors risked appearing weak, or worse, inviting their wrath. He could fracture his own support in a single, rash decision. So a shrewd ruler performed a balancing act. he likely adopted the new god, adding him to the pantheon. The historical record suggests this king maintained a temple with two altars, one for Christ, one for the old gods. He covered all the bases. This syncretism, this blending, wasn't spiritual confusion. It was political genius. By honoring both, he unified his kingdom. The traditionalists saw their customs respected. The progressives, those drawn to the prestige of the Mediterranean world, saw their new faith acknowledged. The king positioned himself as the bridge between the past and the future, the sole figure who could mediate between all the forces shaping his people's world. This is power adapting. It shows that true authority in that age wasn't just about force of arms. It was about perception, about holding the center. The spiritual symbols he chose for his grave were a final piece of statecraft. They sent a message to the living as much as to the gods. They said this king's legitimacy came from every available source, from the deep magic of the ancestral earth and from the divine grace of a global church. He wielded spiritual authority as a tool for unity, a way to hold a population under the stress of cultural change together. In that mound, he didn't bury a conflict. He buried a resolution, a testament to the fact that the most enduring power is often the one that can contain two opposite truths, and that very act of containment would soon define the next chapter of his legacy. One written not in gold but in the quiet work of monks and scribes. The soil at Sutton Hoo consumed the king, 14 centuries in that acidic earth, and not a single bone survived. What was left was just a stain, a human-shaped shadow, and some phosphate dust, the ghost of his chemistry. In a literal sense, he's completely gone. But his presence is overwhelming. We know him better than many figures whose skeletons we actually have. That's the paradox of the burial. The ritual was everything. The substance, the physical body, was almost incidental. The power wasn't in his mortal flesh. It was in the theater of his departure, the coordinated effort for that single day or week. Dragging the ship, digging the trench, building the chamber, placing each object according to a script only they understood. The whole community gathered to witness it. Then the final act, mounding over 20 tons of earth, creating a new, permanent feature on the landscape. This wasn't a private interment. It was a public, foundational drama. Every person who hauled a rope, who placed a treasure, who stood watching as the soil covered the ship, they became participants in making a legend. They weren't just burying a man. They were building a memory, a story so vivid, so heavy with symbolic weight, it would be told for generations, long after the details of his face or his name had faded. The king's physical absence now forces our focus onto the performance of kingship itself. We're left analyzing the props, the stage, the script, the helmet that transformed a man into a mythic guardian, the scepter that claimed a sacred link to the land, the feast gear that promised perpetual generosity, the far-flung treasures that wove him into a global network. That was the essence of his authority, meticulously curated and displayed in a final, magnificent act. The man turned to dust, but the office, the idea he embodied, was cast in a form meant to endure. The ritual was so potent, so rich with meaning, it convinces us of his palpable presence over a millennium later. We feel we know him, because we know so precisely what he wanted us to remember. His legacy wasn't left to chance or to fragile human memory. It was physically encoded into the earth, in gold and garnet and iron, a message intended to echo forever. And in that success, the Sutton Hoo burial poses a final question, a haunting one about the nature of power itself. To understand Sutton Hoo, you have to look past the river. You have to look across the water, because at the same time this king was buried in Suffolk, other powerful people were being sent off in very similar ways. Far to the north, in Sweden, the chieftains at Vendel and Valsgärd were also being buried in ships. Their graves from the 6th and 7th centuries use a familiar language. Elaborate helmets with face masks, pattern-welded swords, ornate shield bosses, feasting gear, the parallels are clear. They point to a shared aristocratic culture that went across the North Sea. A brotherhood of warrior elites who used the same symbols. A man buried in East Anglia would have understood a grave in Upland immediately. They were part of the same world. But then, the differences matter too. The Swedish ship burials often have more military gear, more spears, more arrows, a sharper focus on battle. Sutton Hoo has magnificent weapons, but it balances them with other things. Byzantine silver, so much gold, that unique scepter, the scale is different. The Sutton Hoo ship is enormous, and dragging it inland was a huge public project. It feels like a king commanding his people in a way the Scandinavian burials don't quite match. Then look south to the continent. About a century before Sutton Hoo, a Frankish king named Childeric was buried in Belgium. His tomb had stunning treasures, a gold signet ring with his portrait and name, a cloak fastened with hundreds of gold cicadas, symbols of immortality, a hoard of gold coins, and the severed head of his war horse. The connection here is different. Childeric's burial shows the influence of the late Roman military tradition. The cicada brooches were a Roman military award. His power comes from a mix of Germanic kingship and Roman imperial imagery. Sutton Hoo sits between these two worlds. It has the northern warrior ethos of Vendel, but also that international, almost imperial, aspiration you see in Childeric's grave. It blends them into something new. This comparison shows something important. The elite in East Anglia weren't isolated. They were active, savvy participants in a conversation happening across Europe about what power should look like. They imported the styles, the rituals, the objects, but they didn't just copy them. They curated them. They adapted that shared language to speak to their own local situation, to their own political and spiritual moment. So the grave's unique collection is a record of this. Power in post-Roman Britain was a paradox. It was intensely local, rooted in the loyalty of a specific war band and control of a specific landscape. But it was also profoundly connected, drawing legitimacy from continental trends, trade routes, distant royal courts. A king had to be both a fearsome local chieftain and a player on an international stage. Sutton Hoo is the artifact of that balancing act. It shows a society confident enough to engage with the wider world, yet assertive enough to remix its influences into its own formidable statement. This wasn't a backwater. It was a creative, competitive center, using a common aristocratic vocabulary to write its own Declaration of Independence. And that declaration would soon face its greatest challenge, not from a rival king, but from a quiet revolution in how people thought about life, death, and memory. The mound changed the skyline. It was this artificial hill, and it stayed that way for generations after the king was buried. That high bluff above the river Deben. It was a deliberate location, a piece of strategic theater. Anyone sailing up the river, a major trade route, would have seen it, this smooth, grass-covered dome. A permanent landmark, it announced that this territory was claimed and watched and remembered. It was more than a grave, it was a territorial marker. Clear as a fence post, but infinitely more powerful. It said this land belongs to the lineage of the man inside, his family, his descendants, his people. The mound anchored them to this place physically and spiritually. Think of the effort. After the ship was lowered into the trench and the chamber filled, the community didn't just backfill. They brought soil, load by load, to create a new hill, 20 tons of earth shaped by human hands. This was an act of geopolitics. They were reshaping the landscape to serve memory and power. In a world without grand stone castles, the earth itself was the canvas. By piling it high, they created a focal point, a place for the living to gather. To remember, to connect with the ancestor who was now part of the land. It likely became a site for ceremonies, for affirming the identity of the group that built it. The king's physical body was gone, but his presence was magnified, transformed into a permanent feature of the world he once ruled. This ties into a deep understanding. In many early societies, prominent burial mounds were seen as dwellings of powerful ancestors who continued to watch over the fortunes of the living. The mound at Sutton Hoo would have functioned that way, a constant, visible reminder of a founding contract. The ancestor provided legitimacy and protection from beyond. In return, the living community maintained the site, honored his memory, and through him affirmed their own right to be there. It turned a personal resting place into a communal anchor. So the power of the king didn't end with his passing. It was engineered to persist, to seep into the soil and the stories of those who lived in its shadow. His legacy was no longer just in the objects he owned, but in the very contour of the earth, a monument meant to outlast dynasties, to outwait the slow crawl of the forest. It was a final maneuver, a brilliant maneuver to conquer time itself, but the common people, the ones who built the mound, who farmed the land, who lived in those small settlements. Their world isn't in that chamber. It's a complete silence. You don't see the simple iron plowshares, the worn-out grinding stones, the plain cooking pots, the weaving tools, the everyday knives. Nothing from the mundane economy that actually fed everyone, that clothed the kingdom. That absence is a statement. It tells you what this society thought was worthy of a king forever. Not managing the harvest, not overseeing craft, but warfare and ceremony and connection over great distances. The grave defines elite power in a very narrow way. The power of the warrior, the ring giver in the hall, the diplomat trading with emperors. The king's eternal identity is built on his place at the very top. His link to the earth isn't as a steward of fields. It's as a sacred figure symbolized by the stag. The daily toil that sustained life was beneath this. It belonged to other people. This reveals a stark vision. The king's legitimacy came from a different source than practical governance. It came from myth, from spectacle, from commanding loyalty and projecting strength far beyond the local horizon. But there's another layer to this. Burying the treasure wasn't just about honoring the dead. It was a breathtaking economic act. The value sealed under that mound, the gold alone was a fortune. The garnets, the Byzantine silver, the expertly forged weapons. This was the kingdom's most concentrated wealth, its strategic reserve of prestige, and they deliberately took it out of circulation for good. They removed it from the gift-giving economy, from trade, from any possibility of ransom. Why do that? It was the ultimate display of surplus. It shouted to rivals and subjects, "We are so secure, so wealthy, we can afford to bury our very best. Our power doesn't depend on hoarding this gold in a treasury. We have so much authority, it can be made immortal." It transformed wealth from a liquid asset into a permanent monument. That buried treasure became an immortal bank of prestige. No living rival could raid it or steal it. Its value was no longer in what it could buy, but in the story it told. A story of a kingdom so confident it could lock away its crown jewels and still reign. The mound became a sealed vault, and its contents appreciated in a strange way, not in coin, but in legend. Every generation that lived in its shadow knew the story, knew that beneath that hill lay the proof of their founder's unparalleled status. That knowledge, that shared myth, was perhaps more valuable than the gold itself. It bound the community to a glorious past, and it set a towering standard for any future leader. The king's power was secured not by spending his treasure, but by spectacularly, permanently taking it off the table. The burial was like a seed planted up there on that high ground, and from it something grew, something much bigger than just a grave. It grew into a kingdom. Before that ship was dragged up from the river, this place, East Anglia, it was probably a patchwork, separate groups, families, small chiefdoms, each one holding their own piece of land along a river or the coast. Loyalty was local. Your identity came from your kin, not from a territory, but the Sutton Hoo burial changed that. It was political alchemy. It took the raw stuff of power, loyalty, wealth, memory, and fused it all into something new. Something durable. This wasn't just a funeral, it was a declaration, a new order, a statement so grand, so public, so permanent, that it made everyone who saw it or heard about it rethink where they belonged. The man in that mound became more than an ancestor for his family. He became a symbolic ancestor for a whole people, and the effort itself, that was the point. Hundreds of people from different communities coming together to haul that ship, to build that mound. That act was a unifying act. It created a shared project. A collective memory. Everyone who took part, from the people pulling the ropes to the ones just watching, they all became stakeholders in this new story. They helped build the legend, and by doing that, they bought into the idea it represented. The idea that a single ruling house could command that kind of respect, that kind of resource. This is how territories become kingdoms, not just through conquest, but through the slow, powerful work of shared belief. The treasure they buried was an investment. A staggering investment in political cohesion. By taking all that wealth, that liquid gold, and locking it into the ground, the king's successors made a profound gamble. They traded gold for legitimacy, solid legitimacy. The mound became a fixed point, a North Star for this growing political thing, and in the decades after, the kingdom of the East Angles emerges. Clear in the record, it has a dynasty, it engages in diplomacy, it mints coins, it builds monasteries, it acts like a state. The burial provided the foundational myth this new kingdom needed. A myth you could point to, a hill on the horizon that said, our story starts here. With a king so mighty his farewell reshaped the earth. It shows a deep truth about power when things are fragmented. Political consolidation often walks hand in hand with ritual consolidation. A shared ceremony can bind people more firmly than a shared law, especially when few can read. The spectacle of the burial created a common reference point, a story to tell, a reason to feel part of something larger than your village. It gave this emerging kingdom a past worthy of its future. So Sutton Hoo isn't just the end of a life, it's a birth, the difficult, glorious birth of a kingdom, midwifed by ritual and cemented with gold. That mound was a message. Not carved in stone, but in earth and treasure. A message for the living. We think of graves as private things, a farewell, but Sutton Hoo was the opposite. It was a public address, a political broadcast delivered through ritual spectacle. You have to picture the day, the ship dragged from the river, sitting in its trench. The king's body laid out with all his regalia inside the wooden chamber, the treasures polished and gleaming placed around him. Then the community comes. The warrior elite, but also the farmers, the craft workers, the families, everyone tied to that lineage. They watch the chamber sealed. They hear the first shovels of earth hit the ship's hull. They stay for hours, maybe days, as the mound grows. It was a shared experience, a foundational drama performed right there. Every part of that performance was communication. The scale of the ship showed the dynasty's command over labor. It said, look how many people answer our call. The exotic treasures from Byzantium, from Sweden, they weren't hidden. They were displayed. They said, our connections span the known world. We're not local. We're players on a continental stage. The warrior gear, the helmet, the sword, the shield, that communicated a promise. Protection, strength. It warned rivals and reassured followers that this house could defend its own. Even the location was part of it, high on that bluff, visible for miles from the river. The growing mound was a territorial marker. It said, this land is claimed, watched, remembered by a power that reshapes the earth. The ceremony made kingship tangible. Unforgettable, it reinforced the social order in a visceral way. The man was gone, but the hierarchy he represented was cemented. Those of high rank in life held places of honor in the ritual. Those who labored saw their collective effort become a permanent monument to the authority they served. That's why it's propaganda, not in a cynical sense, but as symbolic negotiation. In a world without mass media, without written constitutions, power had to be performed. Its legitimacy had to be witnessed, felt. The burial was the ultimate performance. It told a story about the king's right to rule, a story so compelling, so saturated with valuable symbols that it became truth. It answered every challenge with a physical object. Question our strength, behold the warship. Question our wealth, behold the gold. Question our divine favor, behold the scepter. So Sutton Hoo is more than an archaeological site. It's a fossilized record of a conversation about power, a conversation held with objects and actions and landscape. The king's successors weren't just burying a great man. They were planting a flag in time, building a legend to justify their rule for generations. The true audience was never the gods of the afterlife. It was the people on the riverbank, watching the earth rise, absorbing a story meant to bind them forever to the idea of a kingdom. The gold didn't speak. The garnets didn't arrange themselves. For every object that declared a king's power, there were hands that made it. We've seen the symbols, now the source, the craftsman, the master goldsmith who bent light into those shoulder clasps, the weaponsmith who folded fire and iron into the rippling sword, the shipwright who shaped an oak forest into a vessel for war and then for eternity. These weren't anonymous laborers, they were the technological elite of their age. Their knowledge was a kind of magic, a secret, guarded language of materials. And in that they held a power. A king could command an army, but he couldn't command skill. He had to attract it, host it, pay for it. The presence of a master artisan in a royal hall was itself a mark of prestige. These individuals were itinerant. They traveled from court to court, their tools their passport. A goldsmith from Kent, trained in Cloisonne, might spend a season in East Anglia, working for his weight in silver. For the promise of patronage, his work would become part of that kingdom's permanent identity, even as he moved on. That's the dynamic. The craftsman's genius was portable, but the object it produced was fixed. An anchor of the king's legacy. By commissioning the helmet, the purse lid, the ruler was doing more than buying a beautiful thing. He was capturing a moment of supreme artistic innovation. Fusing it forever to his name, he was co-opting talent, making another person's lifetime of disciplined skill an extension of his own majesty. Take the sword. That pattern welding process wasn't a recipe you could write down. It was knowledge held in the muscles and the eyes of the smith, the precise heat of the forge, the feel of the hammer strike, the timing of the quench, a performance that resulted in a lethal masterpiece. When the king held that sword, he wasn't just holding a weapon. He was holding the crystallized expertise of a specialist whose services were sought by kings across the north. The object became a meeting point, where the craftsman's technical authority met the king's political authority. One couldn't exist without the other. The ruler provided the wealth, the security, the raw materials from across continents. The artisan provided the transformative skill, the skill that turned those materials into statements of unquestionable legitimacy, a deep, symbiotic relationship buried in every hammer mark and solder joint. So power flowed through many channels, not a simple line from the throne, a circuit. It ran from the king's hall to the goldsmith's bench, from the royal purse to the distant mine, from the warlord's ambition to the shipwright's calculations of hull and tide. The buried treasure at Sutton Hoo is a map of that circuit. Each glittering item is a node, a place where resources, skill, and intention converged. The king's greatness was a collective project, authored by the diplomat who secured the Byzantine silver, the trader who brought the Indian garnets, the artist who set them into a dance of gold and light. To understand the king's power, you have to hear the quiet, steady tap of the craftsman's hammer. A sound just as foundational as the clash of swords or the oath sworn in the mead hall, because in that sound raw material was being transmuted into the very language of rule. The craftsman's hammer tapped for a king, but the hands that commissioned the work, that's a different question. Sutton Hoo came from a warrior's world. Power was displayed in helmets, in swords, but that power didn't exist in a vacuum. It was woven through a web of kinship, of family, and in that web women held threads of real influence. Threads that are harder to see, but they were just as strong. The grave goods shout a masculine ideal, but the society that produced them was built on alliances. Forged not just on battlefields but in marriage halls. Think about who organized this funeral. The king is gone, but his legacy has to continue. Someone ensures that. In many early medieval societies, the right to bury someone, to orchestrate the final rites, that was a powerful political act. It often fell to the closest kin. The one with the most to gain or lose in the succession. That could easily have been a queen, a royal mother, a sister. Her goal would be clear: to stage a spectacle so magnificent it would cement her son's claim. Or her brother's claim, to remind every rival, every follower of the dynasty's unmatched wealth, its divine favor. By directing this ritual, she wouldn't just be mourning a husband. She'd be securing a future, protecting her own position and her children's in that precarious moment after a king's passing. Her agency is invisible in the objects, but it may be written in the very fact of the burial scale, its overwhelming presence. Look closer at some of those objects, the exquisite jewelry, the shoulder clasps, the purse lid. These are items of personal adornment, but in that culture, they were also a currency of relationships. Elite women were often central to the economy of gift-giving. A queen might receive such a piece as a bridal gift from a foreign court, a token of a new alliance. She could then bestow similar items on loyal followers, weaving a network of obligation and favor that operated alongside the king's gift-giving in the hall. That intricate goldwork isn't just wealth, it's a social tool. A means of building and maintaining the loyalties that underpin a kingdom. The woman who wore it or who controlled its distribution wielded a soft, diplomatic power. Essential for stability, this reminds us that power was a family business. The kingdom wasn't just the king, it was the royal kindred. Strategic marriages were the glue that could bind regions together, or secure peace with a neighbor. An elite woman moving from her father's hall to her husband's was not a passive object. She was a living treaty, a conduit of customs, of connections, of political intelligence. Her influence in the private spaces of the court, in the raising of heirs, in advising on alliances that shaped the course of events. Her story is less visible in the archaeological record. The record favors the metal of war over the fabric of daily life, over diplomacy, but her role was no less critical. To see Sutton Hoo only as a warrior's tomb is to see half the picture. The consolidation of a kingdom like East Anglia required more than a strong arm. It required a shrewd mind for alliance. It required managing reputation across generations. It required the often invisible work of maintaining the kin networks, the networks that turned a collection of villages into a coherent realm. The gold and garnets in that mound may have passed through a woman's hands before they were laid to rest. Their presence speaks of far-off marriages, of gifts between royal houses, of the quiet, relentless diplomacy that built a throne long before the first clod of earth was mounded over the ship. The king's power was spectacular, but it may have been enabled by a network of influence operating in the background, ensuring that when he was gone, the story he represented would not end with him. The treasures were wrapped in newspaper, put into crates, driven to London. It was the summer of 1939. War with Germany was coming. It was inevitable. So the Sutton Hoo finds were moved for safekeeping. They spent the next 6 years hidden. Some went into a disused tunnel on the London Underground. Others went to a country house outside the city. They waited in the dark, just like they had before for centuries, but this time a different conflict was reshaping the world above. This second burial was about survival. The gold that once proclaimed a king's power was now vulnerable to bombs, to invasion. Its value had changed again. From a political symbol to a national heritage, something precious enough to hide from destruction. When the war ended, the crates were opened, the objects were studied. They were cleaned, conserved, and then Edith Pretty, the landowner who commissioned the dig, she made a decision. She donated everything to the British Museum. A gift to the nation. With that, the treasure's journey took its final turn, a public turn, from a secret chamber in the earth to a glass case in a museum. From a symbol of one man's authority to an icon of a shared British past, this modern chapter is part of the story. It shows how symbols of power from the past can be repurposed. Centuries later, to serve new needs, the burial mound was meant to shape identity for a small, emerging kingdom. Now, in a museum, it shapes identity for millions. It educates, it inspires, it answers a modern hunger, a hunger for connection to a foundational story. The helmet, once worn to terrify on a misty battlefield, now sits under gentle museum lights. School children press their noses to the glass. They marvel at the dragon faces. Historians peer at the intricate patterns. They decode the trade routes. Artists sketch its lines. They find inspiration in the ancient, swirling forms. The objects still wield influence. They're tools for learning, for sparking imagination, for building a narrative of national origins. In that, they fulfill a final layer of their purpose, one that wasn't anticipated. They've become common cultural property. A point of reference that belongs to everyone. The king's lavish investment in his own prestige has paid a different dividend. It provided a tangible link. A breathtaking link to a shadowy age. It makes the Dark Ages vivid, real. The power isn't about commanding loyalty anymore or intimidating rivals. It's about the authority to define history itself. To give a face to a forgotten time, even if that face is masked. The journey from a Suffolk field to a global museum is the last great voyage of the Sutton Hoo ship. It proves some burials aren't endings, they're seeds. Planted in one era, they germinate in another. They bear fruit for generations the original planners never could have seen. The treasure's modern life as a national icon is its ultimate transformation, a final testament to the enduring nature of the symbols we create, the symbols we use to tell ourselves who we are. A single discovery can cast a long shadow, and that shadow can obscure things. For a long time, Sutton Hoo has been the anchor for how we see early Anglo-Saxon kingship. It's been treated as a settled fact, but archaeology doesn't really deal in settled facts. It works on questions, and new questions have come up. They make us look at that mound again with more critical eyes. One big debate is about the site's purpose. We call it a burial, but was it? The central chamber was full of goods prepared for a king's journey, yet the king wasn't there. Not physically, the soil dissolved the body. All that's left is a chemical stain. That absence has led some to an alternative. What if Sutton Hoo wasn't a grave? What if it was a cenotaph, an empty memorial, a monument for a king who died somewhere else, at sea or in battle? In that view, the deposit isn't about sending a body to the afterlife. It's about creating a central place for memory and ceremony, a focal point, a symbolic heart for a kingdom that needed one, even if the founder's body was lost. This doesn't make the site less important, it reframes it. The power wasn't just about honoring one person. It was about manufacturing a sacred geography for a new political entity. New tools have pushed this further. Advanced soil chemistry does more than note the lack of bones. It can map traces of things that vanished. Researchers can see the outline of a wooden coffin inside the chamber. They can detect the shadows of textiles, leather, offerings of food and drink. This forensic approach changes the empty chamber. It's not a void anymore. It's a detailed negative image showing a ritual complexity we could only guess at before, and archaeology has widened its lens. The focus isn't just on Mound 1 now. Surveys show Sutton Hoo wasn't isolated. It was part of a vast, engineered ceremonial complex. There are other mounds, but there are also traces of processional avenues, gathering spaces, earlier graves. This was a ritual landscape used over centuries. The great ship burial becomes the climax of a long tradition, not a sudden event. That context makes us reconsider the king's power. It might have been less about personal, unprecedented authority, more about mastering a place that was already sacred. His spectacular funeral was the ultimate act of claiming an ancient ceremonial center. Tying his new dynasty to the deepest layers of the land's spiritual history, these debates aren't a failure, they're a sign of a healthy discipline. Sutton Hoo is so rich, so layered, that it invites perpetual re-examination. Each generation brings new questions, new technologies. The story of post-Roman power isn't a static picture we uncovered in 1939. It's a dynamic conversation. And Sutton Hoo is still the most compelling voice in that conversation. A truly significant discovery's greatest gift isn't the answers it provides. It's the better, more nuanced questions it forces us to ask. The King's Hill was not the only mound. There were others on that same high ground, smaller ones, quieter. If the ship burial was a symphony, these are just single notes. Fading in one grave, they found a person buried with a simple iron spearhead. In another, just a plain pot, no gold, no garnets, no helmet to turn a face into a myth. These are the burials of the community, the people who built the king's legend, maybe a warrior from his guard, someone from his household. Their farewells were dignified, but they weren't spectacles. They didn't reshape the land, and that contrast, it's not an accident. It's a record written right in the soil, a record of a steeply hierarchical world. The staggering investment in one man's memorial, it only makes sense when you see the ordinary send-offs around him. It shows the social pyramid, a pyramid with one dazzling point at the top. The king's power performed so brilliantly, it wasn't a solitary thing. It was the pinnacle of a structure, and that structure was built on shoulders. On labor, on the loyalty of a much broader population. The farmer who grew the grain for the funeral feast, the carpenter who shaped the burial chamber, the young warrior who stood guard. Their lives and their own passages from this world were framed by a different reality. Their value was acknowledged. Hence the spear, the pot, but it wasn't immortalized in 20 tons of earth. That disparity, it's the silent foundation of the treasure. All of it, the elite culture, the gift-giving, the poetry, the diplomacy, it rested on a base. A base of agricultural toil, of craftwork, of military service that asked for simpler rewards. You can see the social contract of the age right in this cemetery. Protection and patronage flowed down from the king in the hall. Loyalty and labor flowed up from the land. The two burial traditions side by side, they tell the complete story. One shouts of mythical authority, of far-reaching connections, the other whispers of local duty, of personal honor, and both were essential. The king couldn't be a ring giver if there were no warriors to receive the rings. He couldn't command a ship to be dragged if there were no people to pull the ropes. His legendary status required a society that believed in legends and was willing to enact them. So we marvel at the gold, but we have to listen to the quiet too, the quiet of the smaller mounds. They remind us that history's most brilliant spotlights, they often leave the rest of the stage in shadow. And true understanding, it lies in seeing both the light and what it illuminates just beyond its edge. The Roman idea of power was this system, a grand, impersonal machine. They had a word for it, auctoritas, authority, but it was a specific kind. It came from the office you held, from the law, from your place in a vast, written bureaucracy. An emperor's portrait on a coin wasn't just a face, it was a guarantee. It said this piece of metal was worth something because the system behind it said so. His power was projected through stone roads, through tax collectors, through legal codes sent from a distant capital, and loyalty was to the idea of Rome itself. An abstract, almost immortal entity. When that system collapsed in Britain, that particular form of authority just evaporated. The coin lost its meaning because the guarantor was gone. And into that vacuum stepped a different model. We see it enacted in full costume at Sutton Hoo. The Germanic concept of the Dritten, the Lord. This power was the opposite of abstract. It was intensely personal, built not on law but on a web of human relationships. A Dritten's authority didn't come from a piece of parchment, it came from his own body. From his strength in battle, his generosity in the hall, his perceived connection to the gods and ancestors, his followers, the comitatus, they didn't swear an oath to a state. They swore a personal oath to him, to his courage, to his open hand. This loyalty was a living bond, renewed with every gift given, every feast shared. Every victory won, and it was fragile. It could dissolve if the Lord failed to be generous or brave or lucky. Sutton Hoo is a museum of this new power in action. Every object is a tool for maintaining that personal bond. The sword and helmet demonstrate the martial prowess that earns respect. The feast gear is the apparatus of gift-giving. The economy of loyalty. The gold and garnets are the visible proof of the wealth he can distribute. And the burial itself, that colossal communal project, is the ultimate performance of the loyalty he commanded. This is Dritten's ship-made monument, but the grave also holds a profound twist. It shows this new model wasn't born in isolation. It was a hybrid. Look at the Byzantine silver. Those are spoils or gifts from the last living remnant of the Roman system. But here, in this Suffolk mound, they aren't used in a Roman way. They aren't symbols of imperial tax or law. They've been captured, repurposed. They are now personal treasure, absorbed into the gift-giving cycle of the Dritten. They become part of his charismatic aura. Proof that even the mighty Romans acknowledge his worth. The old Roman auctoritas has been melted down, not into bullion, but into a new currency, the currency of personal prestige. And this moment of synthesis is everything. It defines the birth of a distinct English political culture. The future kings of England wouldn't rule like Roman governors. They would rule like Drittens, as war leaders and ring givers, even as they later borrowed the trappings of Roman Christianity and administration. So the legacy of Sutton Hoo isn't just a treasure hoard. It's a blueprint for a kingdom built not on the cold machinery of an empire, but on the warm, dangerous, and deeply human bonds of personal loyalty. The ship burial marks the precise point where one world's broken pieces were picked up and welded into the foundation of another. The ceremony had a sound we can never hear. The Sutton Hoo grave was silent when they found it, but the ritual that filled it would have been loud. Power in that age wasn't just something you saw. You felt it, you heard it. The physical object survived, but the sound of that day is gone. We can only guess at its shape from other places. In a similar high-status burial at Taplow from around the same time, they found the remains of a lyre. A six-stringed instrument made of wood and bone. It's almost certain a king like the one at Sutton Hoo would have had that same music. Picture the scene by the open trench. The great ship settled in the earth, the air thick with the smell of soil and pine tar, and through that the clear, plucked notes of a lyre. This wasn't just background music. It was part of the ritual, a thread to pull the community together, to guide the feeling from grief into reverence, into awe, and the sound would have been shaped by the space. The long, curved trench holding the ship would have acted like a sound bowl. A chant, a recited poem, a voice honoring the dead. These sounds would have been caught and amplified by the wooden hull and the earthen walls. They would have rolled over the crowd with a physical presence. This was acoustic engineering, even if they didn't call it that. It made the ceremony immersive. Unavoidable, when a poet recited the lineage of the king, listing his ancestors and deeds, those words wouldn't just be heard. They would resonate, they would vibrate in the ground. The sound became a carrier for memory. It made the stories feel true and immediate and eternal. This layer of sound was a direct conduit for power. The rhythm of a funeral dirge could synchronize the crowd's breathing, their heartbeats. The epic poetry recited over the body wasn't entertainment. It was political doctrine set to meter. It defined what made a good king: bravery, generosity, loyalty, and said this king had it all. By listening, by being swept up in the sound, the community participated in affirming that truth. They weren't just witnesses, they were a chorus. Their collective silence, their shared reaction to the music and words, was a form of consent, an agreement to the story being told about their ruler and about themselves. So the power performed that day was multisensory, the glitter of gold in the sun, the heft of the earth being shoveled, and the complex tapestry of sound, lyre, voice, the rustle of 100 people moving together. The sound made the ritual sticky. It cemented the visual spectacle into emotional memory. Long after the mound was covered in grass, people would remember the sound of that day. The way the poet's voice cracked on a certain line, the particular melody that seemed to hang in the air over the river, these ephemeral details, now completely lost to us, were likely the most potent glue of all. They turned a political event into a shared sensory heirloom, passed down not in objects but in the stories of how it felt to be there. And that feeling, carefully orchestrated, was the final, invisible treasure buried with the king. A poet broke the silence of the grave. This was in the 20th century. Seamus Heaney, the Irish poet, wrote a sequence called The Ship of Death. He was drawn to Sutton Hoo. Not for the treasure, he was drawn to its voice. Heaney saw the burial as an oracle, the past speaking through the soil. In his poem, the ship becomes a vessel for language. A ghostly keel, a cargo of silence, a word hoard. He wasn't writing history. He was listening for an echo, and in that, he performed a modern version of what the builders did. He re-mythologized the place. He took the archaeological facts and breathed a new life into them, a poetic life. That's how Sutton Hoo escaped the museum case. It became a story again, a story for writers and filmmakers and artists. This adoption into culture is a second discovery. After the archaeologists came the storytellers. Novels have been woven around the mystery of the nameless king. Documentaries return to that field in Suffolk. They scan the earth with new technology. Each retelling adds another layer. In these retellings, Sutton Hoo is rarely just itself. It becomes a symbol for the haunting beauty of a lost past. For the thrill of a sudden, transformative find, for the deep, often painful search for origins, a novelist might use the empty burial chamber to explore absence. To explore identity, a filmmaker might focus on the 1939 dig, framing it as a moment of light before the darkness of war, a last glimpse of something unified before another collapse. This process proves something: the most powerful historical legacies aren't static. They aren't sealed under glass, they are alive. They endure because they are flexible. They can mean different things to different ages. That 7th-century king was buried to cement a political reality, but for us, he becomes a mirror. We see in his treasures our own fascinations, with craftsmanship, with long-distance travel, with the need to make a mark that outlasts a lifetime. The helmet isn't just battlefield gear anymore. It's an icon of early England, on book covers, in television series, instantly recognizable. It signifies a beginning. This constant reinterpretation is the true afterlife of Sutton Hoo. The king aimed for eternal fame through gold and earth. He achieved it, but not in the way he expected. His fame lives in the realm of ideas now, in imagination. He's become a character in our contemporary stories, stories about history, about archaeology, about who we think we were. Each poem, each documentary, each novel is like another small offering placed in the burial chamber. A new gift to keep the story going. The site's power endures not because it gives all the answers. It endures because it leaves room for our questions. It invites us to complete the narrative, to fill the silence with our own wonder. And in that shared act of imagination across centuries, the ship keeps sailing. The Sutton Hoo ship sailed a long time ago, but the questions it raises, they don't really age. You can look at that burial mound and see a kind of blueprint. For authority, not just in the 7th century, but for how power works in any time, that king understood something basic, that to lead, you need a story people can believe. And that story isn't just told with words, it's told with objects, with actions, with the landscape itself. He used a funeral, the ultimate spectacle, to set that story into the ground. Today's leaders in politics or business or culture, they work on a similar principle. The stage is different. They don't bury warships, but they craft narratives. They use architecture, skyscrapers, campuses as territorial markers, just as powerful as that mound on the bluff. They deploy symbols, logos, uniforms, rituals. To create identity and loyalty, they control resources, not to hoard them in a grave, but to show capacity, security, through big budgets and strategic investments. The core mechanics are echoes. Power still needs a material foundation. It still demands a public performance, and it still tries to build a legacy that lasts longer than the person. Sutton Hoo makes you look at your own world and ask, what stories are we being told? What spectacles are shaping our sense of community? When a leader gives a speech in a grand hall or unveils a new product in a choreographed event, that's a modern form of the same negotiation. They're performing authority, hoping it will be seen and accepted. The legacy part is the most haunting parallel. That king invested everything in one magnificent statement. Meant to define him for eternity, he traded liquid wealth for immortal prestige. We still do that. The philanthropist who puts a name on a library, the founder whose vision becomes a corporate culture, the artist who creates a definitive work. These are all attempts to convert temporary influence into a permanent mark. They're bets on the future, hoping the story they've built is the one that endures. So what would a future archaeologist find digging through our time? They wouldn't find a helmet or a scepter. They might find the husk of a data center, the concrete footprints of a financial district, the curated digital archives of a social media empire. Our treasures are data streams, intellectual property, global brand recognition. Our ships are rockets and server farms, but the human impulse stays. The need to show, through concentrated effort and resource, that you command loyalty, that you're connected to a wider world, that your authority is both formidable and legitimate. Sutton Hoo, in all its silent grandeur, holds up a mirror. It doesn't show us a king, it shows us the enduring anatomy of influence. It asks what we're building our mounds out of today, and what stories they'll tell when we're gone. Sutton Hoo still has things to say. We know the big story from the ship mound, but there are quieter stories there, and we're going to hear them differently now. Not just with shovels, with radar pulses, with chemical traces, with bits of DNA so tiny they're caught in the dirt. Our tools for listening are different. They can turn those quiet hints into something we can understand. Think about surveying the ground, not the mounds you see, but what's under them. Ground-penetrating radar sends waves down. It shows disturbances, voids, things buried for 1,000 years. It might show the shapes of more ships, smaller burials, a whole family's graves, or it could find post holes. For a great hall, the hall where this king actually held court, finding that settlement where people lived would change everything. It would turn a burial ground into a whole kingdom. You'd see where his power worked every day, not just where it was buried. Then there are the artifacts. We know the garnets came from far away, but new analysis could trace them. Not just to India, but to one specific place. It could map a trade route exactly. The silver, too. New methods might tell if it came fresh from Byzantium, or if it was melted down from older Roman silver. That tells you if it was a new gift or an old treasure reused. Every object has a longer story. You start to see the journey it took. The most personal clue might be from what's missing. The king's body is gone, but his biological trace might still be there, in the soil. Scientists are learning to pull ancient DNA and proteins from dirt. From the chemistry a burial leaves behind. It's a long shot, but maybe one day we get a genetic signal that could tell us about his ancestry, his health. What he looked like. It could link him to other royal lines across the water. We could move from guessing a name to knowing his blood. That's the thing about a place like this. It's not a closed book, it's an open question. Every new tool is a new way to look, a new way to ask the ground something better. Our idea of that time isn't finished. It's a conversation between the past and our curiosity. The promise is knowing that field under the grass is still holding secrets. The next big find might not be gold. It might be a data point, a soil sample, a faint image on a screen, and suddenly the whole story shifts, comes into a new kind of focus. Sutton Hoo isn't done talking. That ship in the Suffolk soil, it was a question. What remains when an empire falls apart? The answer in that burial chamber, it's not a simple one. It tells us power in that new world was a performance. A living performance, a constant negotiation between the old gods and the new, between the local hall and the distant emperor's court. It was forged in the smithy, displayed at the feast, worn on the body, and then buried in the earth. The king, we may never know his name, he understood. To rule was to tell a story. A story so compelling it would outlive him, and he used every tool, the terror of the dragon helmet, the wisdom of the stag scepter, the generosity of the silver bowls. That far-reaching web of his treasures, he used all of it to write that story, in a language everyone could understand, a language of spectacle, of connection, of memory made permanent. Sutton Hoo, in the end, it's not just an archaeological site. It's a mirror held up to a pivotal moment, a society in the act of becoming. A people picking up the pieces of a fallen order, and with this astonishing creativity, building something entirely their own from the fragments. They looked to the northern seas and the southern empires, to pagan myths and Christian promises, and they wove them together into a new tapestry of authority. The true legacy of that ship burial, it's the blueprint it left behind. A blueprint for how to construct meaning and community and identity from the ground up in an age of uncertainty. It reminds us, even in times of great change, that human drive to create order, to leave a mark to be remembered, it's a force that can shape the landscape itself.